if you were a business owner, or if you are a business owner, what do you think is the utmost importance for you? Is it the bottom line, meaning after all your expenses, you end up with a net profit or net income? An indicator that you are profitable. Is that the ultimate importance if you are a business owner? Or is it significance? That you and your company has an impact on the environment, on society. It enriches the lives of people, the customers, and the people you employ. So which is of utmost importance or ultimate importance? Bottom line or significance? Or for example, for others, if you do business, what's more important? Okay, to make a lot of money for your kids and live a comfortable life. So, like many of our parents, work so hard so that we, the next generation, don't have to go through all of the hardships that we go through. Is that how we view business? Or is it a platform? A platform that we can use to reach out to people with the gospel. So how do you view your business? Now what about those who are employees? When you work for your employer, do you look at your job as simply something to make money to pay the bills and to have enough to live on comfortably? Or do you look at your work as ministry? It's an opportunity for you to become salt and light in the workplace. So what is work for you? This morning we are continuing our study on Leviticus 19. And as you've already known from our previous message, Leviticus 19 is all about holiness. And 2 weeks ago we learned that holiness is about being separated for God's purpose and for God's ownership. And we've learned that holiness should be seen in how we worship the Lord. We worship the Lord properly through our respect of authority, through our observance of Sabbath rest, by saying no to idolatry, and by enjoying our fellowship with God. Now, I did mention that holiness doesn't just govern our worship, but it governs all areas of life. It's not limited to the confines of the four walls of the church, but instead holiness is to be lived out there, wherever God may put us. It has to be lived out every day. And holiness is best seen in how we would treat people. People aside from God, aside from our parents. So how do we treat our neighbors? How do we treat our employees, our employers? How do we treat the people who work in our homes, our maids, our drivers? How do we respect those who are our peers in the workplace? That is why Leviticus 19 mentions the workplace or the marketplace as a place to exercise holiness. Now, the workplace or the marketplace is an arena where Christian life can be lived out, or where the Christian can live out holy lives to its fullest, because there are certain dynamics involved in the workplace. First, there's relationship with different kinds of people. Now, we know that the dynamics inside a family is already very hard because you have father, mother, okay, husband, wife, children, all of that stuff. Okay? But then if you're in the workplace, it gets even more complicated. Because you have employer-employee, customer, manufacturer, supplier, all of those stuff. Okay? Bank regulators, government. So you deal with a lot of relationships. And then second, there's the keeping of rules and regulations. If the family, if we say that there are rules and regulations, it's much more in the workplace or in the business world. Because you're not just talking about internal rules that govern a company, but you're talking also about keeping the rules of the government. That's why we could say that it's a challenge to holiness when you're in the workplace. And then of course there's the balance of concern and fairness. That means that in the workplace, it's not just all about fairness, being just, but there's also the issue of, being concerned for your people. In other words, you don't just fire people indiscriminately, but you also have to be concerned about why they're underperforming, things like that. Okay? So you see, in the workplace, there's a lot of dynamics taking place. And it's, in a way, we could say one of the better places where we could live out holy lives. Why? Because we're outside of a laboratory. The church, the four walls of the church is like a laboratory. Okay? But once you're outside there, it's the real world. And that's why it's a challenge. And at the same time, it's the best opportunity to live out holy lives. But then how can we do it? Leviticus 19 gives us 3 principles that govern business practices. And these principles aren't just limited to business. They also apply inside our homes and even in other situations outside of the workplace. Now let me begin with a bit of background. 2 weeks ago I mentioned Israel was being prepared for life inside the Promised Land. Now when they enter the Promised Land, there are 2 things that they would face. First is prosperity. Because when they enter in, God says that they would be entering into a land that is full of milk and honey. So in other words, it would be a prosperous land. But then as they enter into the land, there are also temptations they have to face. That is the second challenge. And the temptation is this, to become like the occupants of the land. The occupants of the land were the Canaanites. And the Canaanites were pagans. And so there was the temptation to behave, to think, and to act like the pagans. Now, the Canaanites had practices that were corrupt. And these covered 3 areas: worship, relationships, and even their business practices. Now, when God commanded the people of Israel to be holy, and when he talked about the workplace, he was referring to the context of agriculture. You see, agriculture was the dominant economy of the ancient world. And wealth was made through farming or the tending and the domesticating of animals. That was how work was done primarily. Trading usually happens within the bigger cities, the buying and selling part. But most of the time, or most of the people were involved in agriculture. Now when the Israelites entered into the Promised Land, we know that they were supposed to divide the Promised Land according to tribe, and then according to the clans, and then by family. And each family was supposed to possess a piece of property which they could work on and was to be passed on to the next generation. And the reason or the rationale behind this was so that every Israelite would call a place, a certain plot of land, their home, and it could be a place where they could survive, where they could till the ground, sow, and harvest. So that was the idea why every Israelite family, except for the Levites, but every other Israelite family had a piece of property. Now, under normal conditions, and if the people work hard tilling the field, there shouldn't be poverty, supposedly. Okay? Under normal, or we could say ideal conditions. There would be no need for people to look for jobs in other people's fields. But the reality is this: there will be some who will not prosper like others. There will be conditions that will affect the livelihood of people. For example, people who depend on the soil have to depend also on rain, right? And so, in the Bible, we find many cases where there would be famine, okay, or drought, and then later this would cause famine. And then there would also be cases of pestilence, the locusts coming in and destroying the field. And then There were the neighboring countries who would come in and raid the fields of the Israelites. And so there were certain conditions that were happening that caused poverty or that caused economic hardships for the people. But not only that, in Leviticus 19, it was foreseen that there would be foreigners who would live among the Israelites. Now, who were these foreigners? These foreigners would probably be people who had chosen to associate with the Israelites. Like for example, when Israel left Egypt, there were some Egyptians who came out with them, who followed them. And the reason was because they believed in the God of Israel. Now, they could enter into the land, they could enjoy the land. However, because they were not the people of Israel, they could not own property. And so, their option for work was limited. They had no property that they could till and sow and harvest. And so most of them would work as hired hands in the farm. And so this is the context that we find when the Israelites will be entering into the promised land. Now from that, God gave at least three principles that we can draw from the various commands that were given in Leviticus 19. Now we can look at these three principles as being the legs of a stool that make up holiness in the workplace. Now this idea of the stool is not original. It came from a business ethics book entitled Just Business, written by my Tukayo, Alexander Hill. He is a business professor at Shadow Pacific University. This is a Christian business ethics book. And I would suggest that if you are in business or if you're studying business, this is one book you should read. Now don't try to borrow from me. Someone borrowed it from me and never returned it to me. Okay? And if you're the one who borrowed it, you better return it to me. Okay? Now, in this book, he suggests or he proposed that there are three characteristics involved when you talk about business ethics in a Christian worldview. And these are the three legs of the stool: holiness, love, and justice. So that was his idea, and I think that in some ways it's right. Holiness, love, and justice. But then, in light of Leviticus 19, since Leviticus 19 is all about holiness, I want to propose a different kind of stool. Okay? The legs instead are justice and fairness, compassion, and honesty. Justice and fairness, compassion, and honesty. These are the components that we could say in terms of business practices would make up holiness. And without these three elements, there is no holiness in the workplace. If there is no justice, if there is no honesty, if there is no compassion, then there is no holiness whatsoever in the workplace. So let's look at each of these 3 points. I'd like to begin with verses 35 and 36. Here, holiness in business requires honesty in all our dealings. In verses 35 and 36, the Lord commanded the Israelites to never use dishonest standards when they measure length, weight, or quantity. But instead, the Lord tells them, you must use honest scales and honest weight. Now let me read to you a comment from the NIV Study Bible, commenting on these 2 verses. It says, in a culture with no bureau of weights and measures, cheating in business transactions by falsification of standards was common. Back then, the standards for weights and measures were not standardized like today. Like today, when you say a foot in measurement, it means 12 inches or something like 30 centimeter. Okay? It's not going to change. It's fixed. If you said a kilogram, it automatically means 1,000 grams. Or if you convert it to pounds, it is 2.2 pounds. When we say a gallon, it means 3.78 liters. Okay, today we have those standards of measurement. But back then, people could cheat you. They could manipulate the scales and the measuring sticks that were used. For example, generally for the Israelites, when they say hand width, it means something like 4 inches. But then, of course, if your hands are smaller, okay, then it's less than 4 inches. Okay? So if you're going to buy something from someone, and you're going to use the hand to measure, be sure that his hands are bigger. Okay? Anyway, back then, people could cheat you. They could manipulate the scales, they could manipulate the measuring sticks. A merchant would tell you that a certain item is worth so much per measured weight. But the reality is that it would probably be short by a few ounces. They may sell you a jar of oil that supposedly contains a certain liquid measure. But when you open it, it's probably only 3/4 full. And so that was how people back then cheated others. They used dishonest scales and dishonest standards of measurement. God forbids such practices. It is because when you practice these things, it is dishonesty. You are being untruthful. Dishonesty is to portray an item as having a certain value, but when the buyer receives the item, it is less than what was declared. That is dishonesty. Now, the Lord is a God of truth, and in Him there is no falsehood. And so He is distinct from the gods of the Canaanites. And so if the Israelites wanted to become a holy people, they had to exercise honesty in their business dealings. Now today, dishonesty is still prevalent in the workplace and the marketplace. If you go to the wet market, there are still stories of vendors who cheat buyers by using defective scales. It still happens today. But then dishonesty is no longer limited to simple transactions that take place between a buyer and a seller. Dishonesty also is found inside offices and companies, between employers and employees. There's this article that I read on the internet about dishonesty in the workplace, and in this particular article they gave a list of how employees can be dishonest. First, there's such a thing called account padding. You know, slipping in your personal expenses onto a business expense report. Embezzlement, to steal money from the company. Inventory theft, stealing items for resale or for personal use. Phantom vendor, what does that mean? It means that you as an employee, you create a fictitious vendor. And you make invoices so that you can funnel payment to yourself. Time abuse. Having a co-worker clock in for you when you are running late for work and you want when you want a longer break. Of course, nowadays this can be minimized because of digital technology, fingerprinting. Okay. Probably soon they'll even have retinal scan and facial scan. Okay, we don't know. They'll do that in the workplace. But back then, you could abuse this. Okay, I remember a co-employee in the bank who used to do this. Okay, like he would clock in as if he was early, and then he disappears from the office for a few hours and then comes back. And no one seems to, get on his case. I don't know why. And then there's false claims of illness. You pretend to be ill. Just because you don't want to go to work, you pretend to be ill and you just call and say, I feel sick. Receiving bribes. Okay? Like if someone gives you a bribe so that you will facilitate their transactions faster. Secretly competing with the employer by engaging in business in the same field. So if your employer is, let's say, someone involved in IT technology, let's say designing software, you on the sideline, you're also doing the same thing, but the worst part is you're trying to get the customer of your boss. So that's how you compete with your employer. Okay, so those are just some means by which an employee could be dishonest. But then employers can also be dishonest. Here are some examples. For example, if you're in manufacturing or construction, and then all of a sudden an accident takes place, and someone gets injured, you try to cover it up. You try to cover up the violations. So that's one way of being dishonest. Another way would be when CEOs and heads of companies inflate the sales and revenue figures so that they could trick investors to put in more money into the company. Third is when companies cheat the government of taxes due. There is a thing called tax evasion, and there's another thing called tax avoidance. Okay. Tax avoidance is legal. It means that you think of all legal means in which you can pay lesser taxes. But tax evasion is definitely wrong, because it's simply saying, I will not pay the government, period, or I will pay less than what I'm supposed to be paying. So those are just some of the means by which employers or companies can be dishonest. And so you see, dishonesty is prevalent in the workplace. But we as Christ followers, we should not just resign to the fact that this is what is happening. We might as well go with the flow because everyone is doing it. Because holiness calls us to be truthful, to be honest, even when no one else is. This applies even to how we treat the people who work in our household. Like for example, our maids, our kasambahay, our katulong. Okay? When you say that you will pay them a certain amount, you have to be sure that you do as you have promised. When you say that you will remit their SSS contributions, you better be sure to do it. So in other words, in all relationships, we have to exercise honesty. And especially in the workplace, where there's a lot of dishonesty, we as Christians must exercise honesty to its fullest. Second, holiness in business requires us to act justly or fairly. That's in verse 13b. The Lord prohibited the Israelites from engaging in the practice of withholding the wages of a hired man overnight. In other words, if the man has worked for you from morning till 6 in the evening, then you better pay him immediately. Moses would reiterate this idea later on in Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15. He wrote, do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother, Israelite, or an alien living in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset, because he is poor and is counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Now back then, hired men were supposedly paid daily. That means if you did, let's say 12 hours of work for that day, at 6:01, okay, after your work is done, it's payroll time. Okay, that was how it was done then. And the reason was because these people who were hired hands, they needed the money to feed their families. They were what we call as people who live on subsistence mode. Okay. And this includes their fellow Israelites and also the foreigners or the aliens working there. Now, when we talk about subsistence mode, there's a Filipino saying or Filipino idiom that would best describe this picture. It is the idiom, and it was later sang into a folk song, isang kahig, isang tuka. Or in English, one scratch, okay, this is literal, one scratch, one peck. Okay? And the picture is that of a chicken. We know that the chicken, okay, when it starts to look for food, it will scratch the dirt, and when it finds food, it doesn't take the food and set it aside and keep on scratching and accumulate some more. That's not how a chicken does it, right? What the chicken would do is one scratch, he finds food, he pecks on the food, and he eats it. And so the idiom, okay, means that the income made for one day is just enough for the meals of that day. That's the meaning of the idiom. And so this explains why Jesus, in the parable of the generous master, he portrayed the picture of hired men being paid at the end of the day, right? If you remember the parable. And so this was supposed to be the right practice. That when the people had done their work for the day, immediately it was payroll time. Unfortunately, the pagans, the Canaanites, they would withhold the wages of the hired men. They would promise to pay them once the day is over. But then they would hold back. They would not pay them that day and instead probably pay them on the next day or probably a few days later. That was a common practice among the pagans. And so a cruel master who practiced this was not just being dishonest. He was being unjust or being unfair. You see, the worker has already done his share. He has worked for you, or he has worked for the landowner. And so the landowner, to be fair, must do his part. He must pay them accordingly. Now, unfairness or injustice still exists in the modern economy. Some of the clothes that we wear are made in places called sweatshops. I don't know if you've heard of this term. There would be lines of sewers who would work for 8 hours a day, but then they are paid below the minimum wage in conditions that are deplorable. Now, these sweatshops would usually make tons of money for the big brands because they sell their products to us at a high price, but the cost is so low. So try to imagine this. Okay? Let's say a foreign brand. They sell you a piece of clothing for $100. But the cost of manufacturing that particular garment is probably less than $2. Try to imagine the profit margin, $98. And so imagine that the company, okay, collects $2 for each piece of garment. Okay? And then they would give to each employee probably just a few cents for that one piece of garment. And so that's how sweatshops operate. The owners make a lot of money, the subcontractors, they make so much money, but the employees will suffer because of this. But they cannot complain because, for example, in the US, many of the people who work in sweatshops are illegal aliens. So if they complain, all the owner has to do is then brought their case before the Immigration Bureau, and they will be deported. So these people have no recourse. They have to work in these sweatshops. Now, every businessman, I'm sure, wants to make income. Right? No one wants to go into business to lose money. Okay? However, you cannot make income by acting unfairly towards your employees. You have to be just towards them. This coming Thursday, there is a wage increase upcoming for the minimum wage workers. According to the law, 21 pesos will be added to their income. And so I hope that all of you who are running businesses and you have people who are receiving minimum wages, you will give them what is due to them because it is mandated by the law. But then justice and fairness is not just about paying the right wages or giving the proper benefits. It also dictates how we are to treat every employee that works for us. And this means that you cannot play favorites, nor should we give those we don't like a hard time. There are some bosses who do that, right? They play favorites to some, and then to others, they give them hell in the workplace. Let me share to you one of the most disturbing pictures I have seen with my own eyes. It's with regards to a member of our church. This member of our church, by the way, she's already long gone in heaven already. But one time when our church band, we were on visitation, and we so happened to pass by her home, I saw her. I didn't know about the rest of my companions, but I saw her pulling the hair of her housekeeper while she was on the ground. And when I saw that, I was very much in shock. And sad to say, I did not stop. Okay? We just kept on going, but I should have stopped and I should have gone down and sort of help settle the issue. Now, granted, the housekeeper may have done some crime. Maybe she stole something, or she did something bad. Okay? However, the action of this church member was not fair. It was not just. Why? Because it constituted physical abuse. There is a forum or a place for justice. If that person has stolen from you, you can always bring them to the police, right? You don't need to pull their hair. Okay? You don't need to do that. And so, we need to be just, not just in giving wages, but also in how we treat other people. Justice and fairness applies in all arenas of life. That's why in Leviticus 19:15, like I said, about favoritism, the Israelites, they were commanded, never show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. All of us, we have to admit, we have a bias. We have a bias towards certain people, we have a bias against others. But the Lord is commanding us, be level-headed when you make decisions. When you have to assess people. Be fair in how you treat them. Now, when you say fairness, fairness does not always mean that everyone gets the same thing. No. Because that would be wrong also. Like, for example, you don't give your manager the same wage as someone who is doing minimum wage work. Okay? That would be unfair to your manager. No. But fairness means that you have to judge accordingly. Okay? You give someone who is in higher level management more, okay? Because he's doing higher work, right? For the person who's doing more physical tasks, okay, you give proportionately. Okay? And maybe you add other benefits for those people. Maybe more accident insurance or something because of the work that they're doing. Okay? So the Lord commands us, be level-headed when you make decisions, assess properly. Don't be swayed to favor some at the expense of others. And so as a follower of Jesus Christ, do we exercise fairness and justice in the workplace? Do we exercise justice and fairness at home or even in all our relationships? Lastly, holiness in business calls us to exercise compassion. Compassion. In verses 9 and 10, the Israelites were commanded that they were to leave the edges of the fields unharvested. Also, they were not supposed to pick up the produce that, for example, they were harvesting and it fell to the ground. Nor should they go through the vineyard many times to pick up everything. So, for example, if you own a grape vineyard and you went through it once, and after you have gone through it once and then you notice that it still bore some more grapes after that, the Lord says, don't go back. Don't go back to harvest again. Why? The reason is so that the poor and the foreigners, particularly those who were unable to get work, would be able to feed themselves and their families. A good example of this would be the story of Ruth. If you read the story of Ruth, you will know that Ruth went out to the field, right, in order to glean the field. Okay? Because she knew that there was this law that allowed her to do that. But I want you to notice something. In this particular act of compassion that the Lord has instructed, it is not a dole out, right? It is not a dole out. Why? Because the poor and the aliens, they still had to do their work. They had to harvest the field for what was left over, or what had fallen to the ground, or what was on the edges of the farm. It was quite likely back then that the pagans would maltreat the poor and the foreigners among them. They would allow them to suffer destitution. But God, on the other hand, wants His people to show holiness by being compassionate, by caring for those who are materially disadvantaged. And this point will be continually driven home by God throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Compassion should be a hallmark of every believer when in the workplace. At the same time, compassion must be tempered by wisdom, so that we don't end up supporting those who refuse to do their part by working. It has to be balanced, because the Apostle Paul himself says, he who is not willing to work cannot eat or should not eat. And also, when you show compassion, it should be done with the intention of giving the beneficiary a sense of dignity. And so, giving people something to do so that they can earn their living will generally make people more dignified than giving a dole out. That's why, if you remember the Chinese saying, okay, give a person a fish, they will have something to eat for a day. But you teach the person how to fish, they will be able to eat for a lifetime. And so the idea is that compassion is not so much about giving a dole out, but it's about helping the person find gainful employment. Now, compassion is not just about giving people gainful employment. Compassion can be seen in many other ways in the workplace. Like, for example, you can be compassionate by having a listening ear, especially if you are a boss. Sometimes you need to understand your employees. What are they going through in life? Sometimes it comes when we show sympathy or empathy to those who are mourning, or those who are going through troubles in life. You know, bosses or employers are not so much remembered for what they give to you monetarily, but they are mostly remembered for how they care for you during their lowest points. Like if someone died in your family and you were there to visit them, to give them some forms of assistance and to just tell them that you care for them, that you are mourning with them. Those are the kinds of employers that employees remember. And so, those are some means by which we can show compassion, that we can show that we care for the people who work for us. And of course, compassion can be shown to our colleagues, can be shown to other people. And it should be exercised in all our relationships, not just in the workplace. You see, everyone has a need. It could be a physical need, a spiritual need, emotional, or a relational need. And so how can we address those needs in the lives of the people that you have relationships with? And so, show compassion. Show compassion. In closing, how can we live holy lives? How can we live a consecrated life? Whether in the workplace or in all of our relationships. Remember the three things in the passage. What makes up holiness? Honesty, justice and fairness, and compassion. These three must be present if you want to permeate your workplace, your families, your school, and all your relationships with the holiness of God. You need these three elements. Right now, I want you to just take a minute or two to again do an exercise. Below the message handout, there's a personal application section. And I want you to look at this. It says, I will do the following action steps in the workplace or marketplace, school, or at home as expressions of honesty, fairness, and compassion towards others. So I want you to take a minute or two to just fill that up right now. And after we've done that, I will then close us in prayer. That's great. Father, we thank you because holiness is not something abstract, but instead calls us to be honest, to be compassionate, and calls us, Lord, to be fair and just towards others. And so, Lord, we pray for each one of us here. In some ways or another, we are connected to the workplace, to the marketplace. We pray, Lord, that we would put holiness into action. That you, through your Holy Spirit, would enable us to be holy, just as you are holy. To love that which is right and good, and to despise that which is evil. Father, may you continue to teach us and to help us, Lord, to live holy lives. We pray this in Jesus' name.